I would like to take a moment now to talk about the ethics of fur and leather. It is a hot topic today, as it has been in the past. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the ethical problems with fur and leather, historically and today. Today, there are growing movements against the use of fur in fashion. It is called the anti-fur movement. It consists of many groups that protest and hold demonstrations to try to encourage retailers, designers, and consumers to end their consumption of fur. There are numerous organizations that campaign against fur. In the right image is a group called PETA, which is an animal rights activist group, which has long held demonstrations, advertising campaigns, and other ways to engage the public to try to persuade the end of fur. Real fur is increasingly being substituted for synthetic fur by designers and clothing manufacturers. The switch from real fur to synthetic fur is being done because synthetic fur is cheaper to make and it's easier to care for. However, we must also look at the ethical questions being raised around fur as a major motivator for designers and consumers to prefer synthetic fur over real fur. Historic problems with animal harvesting for fashion. Although fur may be waning in popularity in many parts of the world, this was absolutely not the case throughout history. Fur has been an incredibly important material for clothing since the dawn of man. Again, remember, it was the first textile used by people. Almost every culture has a use for fur, historically. Pelts have been historically coveted, and especially in cold climates, again, where the warmth of fur was needed. If you did not have fur to keep you warm in a lot of cold climates, you would die. It was a matter of life and death, not just prestige. Many cultures today that still live in traditional manners must use fur and leather in their lives. This desire for fur drove the growth of the fur trapping industry, which grew to immense size in the 1800s. The fur trapping industry during this time period was one of the largest industries in the world, and in fact was one of the first global trades. On the right is an image of a trapper from this time period. He is showing his wares. As you can see, no species of animal was safe. I would like to focus a little bit on the sea otters and this fur trade. They were ones that fared particularly poorly during the explosion of the fur trade. Before the expansion of the international fur trade in the late 1700s through the 1800s, sea otters were incredibly abundant throughout the coastal regions of the North Pacific Ocean. All around the Pacific Ocean, from Asia, Russia, through Alaska, down through the coast of California, sea otters called home. As the fur trade grew, sea otters became particularly desired for their soft, dense, and incredibly warm fur. In fact, sea otters have the densest fur of any mammal on the planet. It's also particularly water resistant and quite soft. Sea otters were vigorously hunted until they only existed in a few small areas in America and Russia. Their total population was believed to only be between 1,000 and 2,000 individuals. This was only a small fraction of what it once was, just 100 years before. To prevent the total extinction of the sea otter, which was deemed to be nigh, Great Britain, the United States, and Russia and Japan all signed the Treaty for the Preservation and Protection of Fur Seals. Now, otters are not fur seals, but at the time they were considered as such. This agreement, signed in 1911, placed an international moratorium on the hunting of sea otters. If this had not happened, the sea otter would not be around today. In fact, their numbers were so few that many had given up all hope that they would continue. Luckily, they have. Today, sea otter populations are on the rise and have been saved from extinction. Their populations are growing, but their ranges still are small and not what they once were. They can be seen around the coasts of California and parts of Russia. Again, they still do not have the same range and numbers as before the devastating toll of the fur industry. The birth of the Audubon. Now, this is a bit of a diversion because this is not about fur, it's about feathers, but it still involves fashion and the use of animals in garment making. During the late 19th century and early 20th century, a fad for large feathers and even whole wings and birds on hats emerged. The trend for fanciful feathers on ladies' hats drove many bird species to the brink of extinction, and a few to extinction itself. To fight back against the overuse of birds in fashion, George Bird Gurnall, perfect middle name, decided to create the Audubon Society after the famous painter of birds, John James Audubon. These societies grew in numbers and in areas, and they pushed conservation measures through and were very successful as they pushed through the groundbreaking Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, which banned the use of almost all types of birds for use in fashion. Today, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act still protects a large number of birds from being hunted. Feathers are still used in fashion today, but they mostly come from chickens or other farmed animals and never from the wild. As you can see, fashion and native populations of animals have always been a bit at odds. Rampant growth in different areas of textile and fashion industries has seen very unfortunate declines and extinctions of animal populations. It is incredibly important that anything we do today further must be done in sustainable manners to save animal populations. It is not just native populations that people have ethical issues with when it comes to leather and fur, but also animal cruelty. Many fur activists have accused fur farms of raising their animals under cruel conditions. Indeed, there are fur farms that don't ethically treat their animals. This can include living conditions that are unpleasant for the creature, as well as harvesting methods that do not consider the pain felt by the animal. As an answer to these problems, a new area of ethical fur and leather has arisen. As the ethical question of the use of fur and its negative impacts on the environment, as well as use of animal cruelty, has grown, it has caused consumers to look to companies that promise ethical sourcing of their fur and leather. Ethical fur or leather has no real definite definition, however, and can vary depending on what a person deems ethical. Some view ethical fur as being sustainably harvested from the wild because animals can live their natural life as it was intended. This is usually coupled with rigorous hunting limits so as to not impact the wild population numbers of these animals. Strict limits and control are put on hunters that trap the animals for their fur. Some view ethical fur as being furs raised in farms, where the welfare of animals is a priority. They must be kept in good conditions, live a healthy life, and must be harvested painlessly. These people argue that the natural world should not be in any way embarked upon or harvested from by humans, that any intervention in the wild is not ethical, that it is more ethical to raise animals on farms, ensure they are being treated properly, and harvested painlessly. Others view synthetic alternatives as the only true ethical form of fur or leather, as it doesn't use animals at all. Synthetic fur or leather is, again, man-made, doesn't involve us impeding or imprinting on the wild in any way, and it doesn't involve us raising animals. On the right is a Canadian company called New Outliers that now promises ethically sourced fur. However, be careful. A lot of people use buzzwords like sustainable, ethical, eco-friendly simply for their marketing value, with no real substance behind them. I looked at their website. They certainly do like to promote the fact that they have ethically sourced fur. However, they do not list how they get their fur, what makes it ethical, or where the furs are being sourced from. Makes you question. So, at the end of the day, is synthetic ethically better than real? Should we all use synthetic fur and leather over real leather and fur? Well, there's no right or wrong answer to this question, only different possibilities. And I certainly don't want to sit here and tell you how to think or what the right ethos is for you. I can only bring up certain arguments, but you have to find out what's right for yourself. And again, there is no right or wrong answer. Everybody has their own way of thinking about it and must come to their own conclusions. So as we saw before, a lot of people do think that there can be no ethical fur or leather. However, as we've mentioned before, most cow leather is simply a byproduct of the beef industry. So long as these cows are being slaughtered for their meat, it would be wasteful to not use their skin for leather. Now, here's another dilemma. Again, we've seen fur or leather create incredible environmental problems. And the people who raise or harvest practice cruelty. So those are problems as well. However, synthetic leather and synthetic fur are not problem-free. In fact, far from it. So, just to make a distinction, fake leather or synthetic leather comes by many different names. Today, the popular buzzword for fake leather is vegan leather. It's also faux leather. This is simply because fake leather doesn't sound nice. It's not marketing. The reason that they call it vegan leather now, certainly it is vegan, it doesn't tend to use a lot of animal parts in it. But vegan is a trendy word and it markets well, so they use it. In another 10 years, it'll be something else that's more marketable. But at the end of the day, it's all made the same way. It's synthetic, it's fake, and it's plastic. Plastic pollution has its own problems. So you look down here. This is the Atacama Desert. There is a vast, sprawling clothing dump full of mountainous piles of discarded clothing. Most of this clothing is composed of synthetic fibers, the same stuff that synthetic fur and synthetic leather is made out of. Again, it's plastic. It will not biodegrade. This mountain will sit here long after we're dead, long after our kids are dead, long after their kids are dead, and so on and so forth. It will probably take hundreds and hundreds of years to break down, and then it will just break down into microplastics, which will work our way into our soils and waters. And again, as we see, microplastics is a growing problem in water supplies, soils, and everything else. We are consuming it, just like everything else, as it breaks down into these small parts. We do not know what the long-term effects of the consumption of microplastics is, but we sure as heck will find out as we eat them every day. So, is it ethical to produce more types of fabric that are simply end up here? Now, the reason that clothing waste has become such a big problem is mainly because of synthetics. Synthetics are cheap, quick, and easy to make. This has boomed the fashion industry. It has allowed designers and manufacturers to make large quantities of cheap clothing. Large quantities of cheap clothing has created large quantities of clothing waste. Again, largely waste that is synthetic fabrics. Up here is an image of the Citarum River in Indonesia. It is considered the most polluted river in the world. In addition to the massive amount of plastic pollution, synthetic textile manufacturers dump raw toxic waste directly into this river. You can see that here. This is the main river, and this is a industrial wastewater outshoot. The black is dye, the froth is toxic chemicals, and it is being dumped directly into the river. This has created huge amounts of problems, because as you can see here, this is someone's farm. This is also someone's farm. This toxic waste is going into drinking water, irrigation water, and harms ecosystem. It has killed all of the wildlife and fish in the river. It is also winding up in the crops that people eat and making them sick. People who used to use the river water to bathe can no longer, as it irritates their skin and gives them rashes. So, is it ethical to purchase materials made in such a manner? To continue to play devil's advocate on the right here, let's take another example. In Florida, pythons are not a native species. However, they have escaped captivity as pets and now thrive in the Florida ecosystems. They aggressively compete with native animals, making them what's called an invasive species. This means they threaten the natural balance of the native ecosystems. So, is it wrong to harvest these animals out of the wild for their skin? They are damaging the ecosystem. They do not belong there. Any environmentalist will recommend culling of the species to protect the native ones. So why not cull them and harvest them for their skin? You see, one way or the other is never a right or wrong. It's not black or white. There's only instances. There's a lot of factors in every situation that need to be considered. There is no hard answer as to, yes, we should always use synthetic leather or fur, or yes, we should always use real fur or leather. There is no hard answer like that. Unfortunately, it's just a lot of complicated nuances that need balancing, Every situation is unique and different and needs its own assessment. So be aware of your world and be aware of your choices. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, you must think about all of the possibilities because there is no simple right or wrong answer.